Mr. Namdak asked.
Is she the angry zigzaggy pattern?
Boo! Don't be rude. Not unless you want to be the squiggly green lines. Adrian stood. Well, that's the problem. If the design is about coming together, then really, Mr. Alabi, you shouldn't be speaking for everyone. Why not? I'm so good at it. Adrian ignored this posturing. What if we used just a ribbon of the design superimposed over the bear cub? His artists exchanged dubious looks. A larger version of the bear cub? Like? Mrs. Song sketched her bear cub swiftly in pencil. Mr. Alabi followed with a few strokes of watercolour. No! Everyone spoke at once, almost in horror at the result. What about... It went on for another hour, then 2. Adrian was almost ready to end the session in disgust when his exhausted brain offered up one last idea. The silhouette of the cub, he said, but more stylized, and fill it with Alabi's design. It took another 5 minutes to sketch this out. Adrian stood, stretching. The final result was... no, not quite right. Maybe it was because a bear's silhouette was too bulky, but it lacked a certain something. He wasn't sure what. Like that, Adrian said, but maybe with more sense of movement. Maybe if it's hunting. Do bears hunt? Asked Mrs. Song. Well, I'm sure they must. How else do they eat? Silence reigned for a handful of seconds. Then Mr. Namdak shrugged. We're artists, not animal behavior experts. I don't even go outside unless I have no choice in the matter. How should I know? Adrian sighed. Let's pretend bears hunt. It's probably true. Mr. Namdak, maybe it's trying to catch your dream star fish thing. He could feel the excitement growing in the room as they worked, sketching over each other. That's it. Mr. Namdak smiled, stepping back. That's it. We've done it. There were handshakes all around. Adrian stood back and looked, and thought, and... No, he said to everyone's groans. We haven't, not quite. First, we've promised an 8-plate series. What we have here is 1 plate at best, and it's not even fully fleshed out. An utter tyrant, Mrs. Song said. We are employed by a tyrant, and here it is, 10 at night. Second, Adrian said, I don't love the sketch of the bear cub. I'm not sure what's wrong, but I want more of a sense of play here. This is a cub, not a full-grown animal. And third, we have this cub catching the dream star, whatever it is, on the first plate. That can't be right. It's an 8-plate series. It ought to tell a full story. You don't catch your dreams on the first try, after all. Lots of people do. Mrs. Song rubbed her eyes. But I suppose I see your point. Still, we have a direction. Adrian smiled. We have something that is almost a preliminary design, and this is going to be amazing once we've finished. Enough for the night. We couldn't have done it without you. Adrian just stared at Mr. Namdak and shook his head. You literally could have done exactly that. You're the ones drawing. Oh, stop being modest and go home, Mr. Namdak said. Don't you have something about an annulment to think about, too? All thought of bears and designs dropped from Adrian's head. Home. God, home. He had 1,000 things to do. The designs needed more work tomorrow, and he still had his uncle to please and an annulment to plan. Well, he sighed. Good thing there was the rest of the night. Adrian had expected to find his cottage dark when he returned, and from the outside it appeared that way. But as he was hanging up his hat and coat, he noticed a dim glow from the study. Bemused, he drifted down the hall. Camilla sat at a table, a book in front of her. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She bit her lip and found a strand, worrying it between two fingers as she frowned at the book in front of her. The lamp painted her face in gold and brown. A tiger's palette, he thought. "Hello, tigress," he said aloud. She jumped. Her hands flew in the air. The pen she'd been holding landed halfway across the table, splattering ink. "My God!" She glared at him. "You scared me." "I scared you?" He couldn't help but smile. "You're the tiger. Why should I scare you?" Her eyes narrowed at him. "Clearly you need to sleep." "Clearly," he replied, "I need to do nothing of the kind. Why are you still awake?" Their eyes met again. He was tired. Tired enough that he couldn't quite summon the willpower to politely look away as he should. Tired enough that he let his gaze wander down the swell of her breasts to her waist, down past the smooth curve of her hips. She wasn't wearing shoes, and he could see her ankles. They looked like bronze in the dim light of the lamp. "Your feet must be freezing," he said, and that made him think of kneeling on the floor in front of her, taking her foot in his hand. To warm them, of course, nothing more. "Oh, my feet rarely get cold." Ah, maybe he was not purely selfless then, because that image didn't go away. She gave him a smile. "It's one of my best traits." He couldn't touch her. It wouldn't be fair to her, dependent on him for everything. It wouldn't be fair to him, because if he touched her, he would have to stop. He'd known, up until now, that he thought her attractive. He'd known that he liked her. She was pretty and kind and clever, but she was also legally married to him, and no matter how lovely she was, he didn't want that state to persist. He couldn't touch her, but he wanted to. He wanted it with an ache that was probably just weariness. Right, that was it. Weariness. He'd sleep it off, and it would all be better in the morning. Except he had too much to do to sleep. "Camilla." He said her name just to say her name. Question. He needed to ask her a question. "You didn't tell me why you were still awake." She blinked at him. "Well, that's obvious, isn't it? You said we'd have to write questions for Mrs. Martin to send out tomorrow morning." She gestured to the paper. "I've been doing them." He frowned. He looked at the paper, then at her, then back at the paper. He was tired and, "I should do that." "Too late," she smiled. "I'm almost finished." "You don't really care about the annulment the way I do," he told her. "And it doesn't seem fair that you should have to, under the circumstances. It's not really a bother. I can handle one more thing." She stood. She took a step toward him, and his breath froze in his chest. "You tell yourself that a lot, don't you? That you can take on one more thing?" "Well," he swallowed as she took a step forward. "I've been very lucky in my life. I've been given a lot. It seems only fair that I try to do something with what I have, doesn't it? She took another step toward him. Lit from behind, her expression was impossible to make out. "One more thing," Camilla told him softly. "One more thing. One more thing. Of all the men in the world I could have been forced to marry, it ended up being you. I too count myself lucky. This time, let me do one more thing for you." She was close enough to touch now, and he couldn't. He couldn't touch her. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. She touched him. She reached out and put her hands on his shoulders. It was only strength of will that kept him from pulling her to him. His hands clenched into fists at his side. But it wasn't that sort of touch she gave him. She pushed him, turning him around so he faced the door away from her. He could feel the palms of her hands in the small of his back. "Go to bed," she said. "I'm almost done, and I don't have to be up at 7 in the morning." She pushed him, and what could he do? He couldn't touch her, so he went. He was almost up to his room, half exhausted with weariness, when the thought came to him. "Oh," he said, looking into the darkness, feeling as if he had been struck by lightning. "Tigers. Of course. It's tigers." Chapter 15. Camilla had left the draft of the questions she'd written for Mrs. Martin on Adrian's desk. By the time she came downstairs the next morning, it was gone. In its place was a note. "Thanks, these were excellent. Have sent on. See you tonight." There were no other instructions. That left her with nothing to do all day but think. Always a dangerous prospect. Or walk or read. It was raining. That didn't bode well for walking. Adrian was not much for fiction, she discovered upon perusing his shelves, and he, or rather his family, had the strangest collection of books. A multi-volume set on the production of pig iron, 7 separate tracts on ecclesiastical law that were well marked, and an entire shelf of books on the chemical composition of various dyes. One of the ecclesiastical law books turned out to be a collection of accounts of trials in the ecclesiastical courts. She leafed through them, thoroughly confused by a multitude of words she didn't know. Another book ended up being a legal dictionary. It proved only slightly helpful, as she didn't know half the words used in the definitions. There were 2 accounts of annulment proceedings in the first book. The rain was not letting up. She was supposed to be getting an annulment. Why not read through them? "How are you getting on?" Adrian asked her that night over dinner. "By and by." "You?" He shrugged, much the same as she had. "Possibly. Things are taking shape, I suppose." He didn't say anything about wanting her input. Of course, she realized, they'd need to develop something before she could have an opinion on it, and he seemed sufficiently harried that she did not want to ask. Well, she had reading and she had crocheting. The days slipped by. She read through the 2 annulment proceedings in their entirety, once, and then again, and a third time. The confusing legalistic language slowly started to feel comprehensible after the 5th read. The outcome of the cases, once she understood them, began to bother her more. Miss Jane Leland, an heiress, had been drugged with opium before saying "I do" to a man she had before refused. The courts had refused to grant her an annulment on the grounds that she had insufficiently proven that she did not consent to the opium. By contrast, Sir William Tansey had agreed to marry Lady Catherine Dubois. He had been so nervous at his wedding, or so he claimed, that he had not noticed that her maid, Miss Laney Tabot, had taken her place, and so, he claimed, a fraud had been done on him. It didn't look like fraud to Camilla, not unless Sir William had gravel in place of brains. Sir William was supposed to have married Lady Catherine 6 weeks later, with the banns already having been read the first time before he left. Sir William had claimed that Miss Tabot, purporting to be her mistress, had sent him a letter begging him for an immediate fleet marriage to calm her nerves. There followed pages of text, legal reasoning, it was apparently called, that purported to explain that somehow Miss Tabot had cheated Sir William, even though her actual real name had been used on the register, even though he had spent 4 hours in her company before the ceremony and not once noticed she was a different person than her mistress, even though Miss Tabot stated that Sir William himself had courted her and asked to marry her. Tabot claimed the marriage was consummated, which Sir William denied. The medical examiners claimed that the fact of consummation could not be established. Miss Tabot's testimony was deemed unbelievable. She had committed fraud, the court said. Annulment granted. What is this utter nonsense? Camilla found herself demanding at dinner-time, pointing to the book. Oh, was Mr. Hunter's bemused reply. He had been frowning at a notebook of sketches as he ate. You're reading that? Why? I'm attempting to. I don't understand it. He glanced over, swiftly scanning the pages in question. Well, the court is saying that... Oh, that's not what I meant. I comprehend the words perfectly now. I just don't see how any person in their right mind could possibly have come to the conclusion that Sir William was tricked into marriage. I don't recall what happened. Camilla was warming to her subject. As best as I can tell, this absolute rapscallion obtained a marriage license with her actual name on it, told this poor maid that he loved her, had his way with her, and then claimed the marriage wasn't real and she had tricked him into it. And the ecclesiastical courts agreed. He nodded. I want to get a stick and beat him. I support you in your desire for justice, but the case was decided in 1721. He's probably dead. Then I want to beat his grave, Camilla declared. And it's worse than that. This is the sort of court that decides if we can have our marriage annulled. They have no sense of justice, no principles. What are we doing going before them? Be fair, Adrian said. The men who decided this are all dead, too. It'll be a different set of men. Camilla looked up at him. Her eyes narrowed. She wasn't going to laugh. Is this amusing to you? No, he said. It's not. It's why my uncle's help is of the utmost importance. If they think we are upstanding people, they'll be more likely to treat our story, outrageous as it is, with belief and kindness. If they don't, he shrugged. Well, you've seen it. This all would be dead easy if you were a lady. We could play the lady and the utter blackguard for the court, and the annulment would come too swiftly for us to blink. They'd find a way to make sure you weren't tied to the likes of me. The likes of you? Camilla blazed out. If they say anything about the likes of you, I'll beat them too. As if these idiots could judge anyone's character. I hope she hit him. You hope who hit whom? Miss Tabert, she gestured. Sir William, of course. And then the words he'd spoken came back to her. If you were a lady. And she remembered. She tried to think of her past so little that it no longer registered as a truth about her, not even when he said it aloud. This all would be dead easy if you were a lady. Of course. He didn't know. How could he know? She hadn't told him. She hadn't wanted to look back. They might be able to end this tomorrow, without any of this rigmarole. All she had to do was tell him the one thing that she no longer wanted to recall. He would thank her. She could let him go without letting him see how much she hurt. Or she could keep silent and have him for a little longer, for company, for tea. She looked over at him across the table. For a moment, she wavered on the edge of indecision. Was it even a lie if she simply chose not to tell him the truth? No, it wasn't a lie. Camilla shut her eyes. Camilla, is everything all right? It hurt to remember it. She could not be anything except a scandal to her family. The truth of her birth had no relevance here. She didn't have to tell him. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't right either. She exhaled slowly. There's something I should tell you. Her eyes opened. I didn't mention it earlier. I didn't know it would be of use. But you should know that I used a false name on the registry. He blinked. That doesn't invalidate the marriage, you know. My family name is not Winters. I was born Camilla Worth. She kept her eyes down. My father was the Earl of Linney, and he was hanged for treason. So my family name has no real value. Rector Miles convinced me to use a different name, so that the shame of who I had become would not further damn the rest of my family. They've made it out of this mess. I don't, even if they don't want me. I don't want to hurt them. But you said we could use it, so... She shrugged. Her throat felt hoarse. Here you are. The shame of who you are, he repeated. He said the words slower, enunciating them, grinding them into her soul. Please don't make me say it. I don't even like thinking it. For a long moment, he didn't speak. She could hear the tick of a clock behind them. She shifted uncomfortably. I know you don't believe me, but I thought I should tell you. She lifted her head to look at him. He was watching her, his eyes dark and intense. It likely wouldn't help, you know, he said slowly. Your sister hasn't talked to you in years, and you'd need her to vouch for you. Well, then... But you didn't have to tell me. Why did you? She shrugged one shoulder. She could not speak, not with that lump in her throat. He shook his head and leaned forward and set his hand atop hers. Camilla, I know how hard this has been for you. At this point, you have seen where I come from, what I have. I have several homes, horses, and ready funds. You have nothing. All you would have to do was lie, once, to the examiners, you realize, and there would be no annulment. I would be legally obligated to supply your needs for the rest of your life. Please don't point it out. Camilla didn't want to be tempted. And I know what you want. You want permanence, a place to stay. She couldn't meet his eyes. Someone to care about me. Just a little. And yet here you are, helping me win an annulment that leaves you worse off.
I know, she whispered. I can't help but know it.
Why, then? Because she didn't want to hurt him. Because she made bad choices. Because
you told me the other day that someday someone would love me for who I was.
The room felt large around her. Or maybe she felt unbearably small.
I shouldn't believe it. There is no evidence it can be true. If it could happen, would it not have done so once?
Camilla,
I should not believe it. But I do. I have no reason for hope, so I hope beyond reason. I keep hoping that someday someone will care. I believe that I deserve it, even though I know I cannot. I have known for years that it cannot be, and yet I refuse to stop hoping. You are the only person in the world who has ever told me that I should keep on hoping. I'm not going to repay that kindness with cruelty.
He was watching her so intently, some fierce emotion in his eyes that she couldn't quite interpret. Now that she'd given voice to that hope, it rose within her, strong and indomitable. She was going to be loved, damn it. Someday, she was going to. It wouldn't be him. She knew that, the way she knew that she wished it would be.
You can't steal love, she told him. You can only earn it. And I want to be the kind of person who can still believe, after all this time, that I will deserve it.
That's it. He stood straight up and closed his notebook of sketches. That's what I've been missing. The last 3 plates, of course. We've been trying to tell the wrong story.
Your pardon? Adrian, we should talk about whether we use this—
He almost ran to the door. Sorry. I have to fix this now. It's, sorry. He was putting on a coat and hat, and Camilla was utterly bewildered. I'll tell you when it's done. The smile he gave her was painful and brilliant, and so warm that it felt like it could burn her. I'm sorry, he apologized one last time. I have to go. Adrian barely saw her for days once he understood what to do with the plates. It didn't matter. He gradually came to realize that he had a problem over the course of those days. He spent most of his time at Harville Industries, working with his artists, refining, looking for everything that was wrong, shaping the china designs again and again, until the story meant more and more to each of them. He came home for late repasts. Camilla was always there. She'd tell him about something new she'd read in the ecclesiastical reports, or another idea for when he had time again. They would talk, and he would like it. And he didn't have time to think about how much he was liking it. He really didn't. He'd go to sleep, and he'd think about china designs, about tigers chasing dreams, and the plates weren't about her. Really, they weren't. Every one of the artists involved had a different opinion of what they meant. Mrs. Song didn't precisely cry when they decided on that first plate, a tiger cub chasing that stylized dream over a waterfall into new and strange terrain, but it was close. Adrian felt a strange compression in his chest when they planned out the last one. The plates weren't about Camilla. They were about everyone. Yet somehow, Adrian had started thinking of her as part of that everyone. That yearning just got worse with every passing day. Adrian had a problem, he realized. After he'd been working on the design for so long, his head was spinning with lack of sleep.
truth be told, he'd had one for a while, but he admitted it to himself for the first time on a long night, while they were on the verge of finishing their designs. He realized it at night, in bed, when he was alone. It wasn't cold, and he wasn't lonely, not in any traditional sense of the word. He wasn't one of those sordid creatures who claimed that it was impossible to go for any length of time without having intercourse. Any man who claimed such a need was hardly a man. Adrian had nobody to blame for his problem but himself, and he should have seen it coming. His problem was this. Adrian liked Camilla. He more than liked her. He'd noticed that first dizzying swirl of sexual interest the first day they'd met. She was pretty and so easy to talk to. She listened to him and had her own thoughts. She'd adjusted to the whirlwind that they'd embarked on with a grace that few would have managed. He knew what she'd gone through. He'd watched Rector Miles and the others she had worked with for only a handful of days, and even that alone had been mildly painful to watch. She'd told him everything she had experienced, and as bare as her recital had been, he'd heard her loneliness, her worry. He knew how much she yearned. And still, she'd looked him in the face and told him that she believed she would be loved. It had sunk into his skin. Every moment he spent with her, he found himself wanting, just a little. Every minute in her company, his heart seized with an almost painful gladness. Tonight, she had talked about something else she had found in that book of ecclesiastical law that she had started carrying about. He'd found himself leaning forward, smiling, wanting that future happiness for her, so much that he'd gripped the arms of his chair to keep from reaching out and touching her himself. He let out a sigh. Oh, he had a problem. If they weren't semi-legally married, it might be different. He might have moved his hand to touch her tonight. He might have asked if he could kiss her, just so he could taste the determination in her voice. If they hadn't been married, he could have explored this, slowly, sweetly. But they were something like married, and he didn't want to be. They had to not consummate the marriage, and if they started kissing and touching, no, a bad idea all around. He knew it was a bad idea. More importantly, he knew how much Camilla wanted affection. It would be the cruelest thing in the world he could do, to give that affection she wanted to her, when he didn't want anything aside from that momentary affirmation. That footman she mentioned had done just that to her, used her, and then discarded her. He wasn't cruel. He just didn't want to be married to her. He wouldn't want to be married to anyone like this. He liked her, and he wanted her. He shut his eyes and let himself imagine a different conclusion to their talk this evening, or any of the evenings they'd spent together. He imagined her eyes, sparkling in the lamplight, the fierce determination on her face as she looked across the room and said that she wasn't going to steal love, that she was going to earn it. He imagined that they weren't goddamn, why me, legally married, or whatever this was, and he could tell her the truth. You deserve the world at your feet. She would look at him with a confidence that had begun to creep up on her, a look that suited her, as if it had been perfectly tailored for her. She'd tilt her chin up. Oh? He could just see how she would say it. Why don't you show me? Now he was veering into fantasy territory, but he knew this for a rationalization. It was better to get the fantasies out of his blood than to indulge in more of this foolishness while watching her over supper. God, he wanted to show her what it was like to be desired. Camilla wasn't the sort to lie there passively, not if she were interested as well. He'd do his best to listen to her, to watch her awakening desire, and to stoke it until she was gasping beneath him. He gave up on pretending. He took hold of his hardening cock and imagined her hand on his, the warmth of her exhaled breath in his ear. He imagined her kissing down his neck, her body brushing his lightly at first, and then with more certainty. She'd slide down on him so wetly, so perfectly. His hand was an imperfect substitute, but it would do. He strained up into it, thinking of her, of the little noises she would make as her hips met his. She would smile as he found every sensitive spot with his tongue, ears, breasts, everywhere he could reach. She wouldn't play coy. She'd give herself to him with all abandon. She wasn't the sort to hold back. His hand moved faster. His whole body seemed afire. God, he was an idiot. He couldn't be thinking about her this way. He was going to have to see her tomorrow. He couldn't be wondering what it would be like if they... And then he wasn't thinking at all. His body tipped over the edge, filled with heat and desire. He painfully swallowed his own grunt of pleasure before it came out sounding like her name. He lay in bed afterward, far too warm and more than a little embarrassed. Not that there was anything wrong with masturbation. If it were actually possible to go blind from it, he'd have lost his sight long before he turned 18. It was a bad idea, thinking about her like this. It was possibly the worst idea he could have had. She'd had enough done to her. She'd been hurt too much. She trusted him. He wasn't going to be the person who took her confidence, not when she had so little of anything in this world. And the fact that she might, possibly, be willing to give, that was unthinkable. Because with her, with the way things were, there could be no idle kissing, no mere enjoyment to be found together. If he came to her wanting this, he was married to her for life. He had a problem. But that's what real men did. They had problems on their own, where the solution required a hand towel to clean up afterwards, and not an apology to someone for ruining her life. Well, on the bright side, masturbation was limited only by his refractory period, and it made less of a mess. Camilla didn't realize she was changing until she was almost at the end of her transformation. It started with Miss Laney Tabot, the woman who was seduced and abandoned by the horrid, lying Sir William. She read the court's account again and again. First, she thought, to learn what was happening and how she could do better. Then she started reading it with her crochet hook in hand, thinking and wondering, and crocheting without truly knowing her own thoughts. She imagined that she was Miss Laney Tabot, born a century and a half before, betrayed by the man she loved. It was easier to imagine herself angry on behalf of someone else than to think of her own situation. The anger she felt for Miss Tabot was almost unbearable. So she crocheted, and she imagined. She imagined herself facing the ecclesiastical court and giving testimony as Miss Tabot had undoubtedly done. Camilla wouldn't beg for them to not annul her marriage with a man who clearly didn't want her. No, Camilla, as Miss Tabot, would wreak maximum embarrassment. No, she imagined herself saying with confidence, tilting her wrist just so. Of course we didn't consummate the marriage. He wanted to, but I took one look at his private parts and... syphilis, you understand. Poor thing. They said that hell had no fury like a woman scorned, but they were wrong. Women were scorned again and again and again. It was only after the 70th scorning that they let loose a fraction of their righteous anger. Frankly, men had no idea how lucky they were that any woman was rational at all. Day after day, Camilla honed Miss Tabbert's speech, muttering it to herself as she paced in the library or as she walked through the little clumps of trees along the river-bank. She honed it as she crocheted, finished her scarf, and ripped it apart again for yarn. She wasn't sure when she started delivering her own words, when, instead of the sordid details of Miss Tabbert's unwelcome ruination, she started talking about what had happened to her instead. I just wanted to do what was right, she told a stand of willows. I was trying to do what was right, and they ruined me. She thought of the look on the rector's face. They made me feel shame for my friendliness, for my willingness to trust others. They made weaknesses of my strength. Her eyes stung with hot tears, and she clenched her hands together. I won't let them, she said blindly, through the hot veil of her tears. I won't let them have me. I won't let them make me weaker or stupider. I'm not going to let them take me away. She imagined Miss Tabbert standing at her side as she spoke. 3 days in, she looked at her crocheting and thought of old Mrs. Marsdell, the woman who she'd tried to impress by learning to crochet. Adrian had told her that she should try to look back eventually. Every time Camilla thought of Mrs. Marsdell, she remembered those sniffs and suspicious looks. Camilla had opened her heart and she'd learned to crochet. The feel of yarn beneath her fingers gave her strength. The activity let her think in ways that simply sitting did not. She had tried to give, and giving had made its own form of return. Once she started thinking of it that way, she could look back a little more. Camilla had read a book of fairy tales to baby Angela. When times were hard, she still thought of women who kept on going, even when there was no reason to do so. Camilla had learned to kiss from Larissa. She had learned to put a square sheet on a bed from Kitty. Camilla was a collection of things she had learned from the people she had loved. They hadn't loved her back, but she'd taken everything she learned with her anyway. All this time, she thought she'd found nothing in all those years. She looked up from the chair in her room, crochet hook in hand. A mirror stood on the wall. She eyed her pink-flushed cheeks. Love hurt, but love had shaped her too. It would this time as well. Adrian was going to walk away one day, but if the past were any sort of guide, she wouldn't leave him empty-handed. What would she take from him? If she could choose. If she could choose anything, it would be that confidence she had so often seen on him. Could she learn that? She considered it, and she watched him, wondering where that wellspring of braveness came from. It took Camilla 5 days to make friends, across the span of 100 years, with Jane Leland, opium-drugged heiress, and Miss Laney Tabbert. It had taken her 7 to read their accounts so often that she knew what she and Adrian needed for this annulment. Proof. Absolute proof. Indisputable proof. They didn't yet have it. It had taken her 10 days to think about going back, about really going back. She pushed the thought away the first time it intruded, then the second. If it had been just her own future at risk, she wasn't sure she could manage it. But for Lainey Tabot, for Jane Leland, for the women who had not had a chance for justice, she thought she might be able to try. The men who had hurt them were long gone, but if she did nothing, Bishop Lassiter would one day, maybe, sit over a question of annulment. Rector Miles would hear from women who had been injured by men on a near-weekly basis. There was no justice for the dead, but there were too many women still living in need of kindness. For Lainey and Jane, Camilla allowed herself to imagine that she had the courage to act. She imagined herself walking into the household. The long-dead women would walk invisibly by her side, present only in her imagination. The first time Camilla imagined going back, she cried by the riverbank. She didn't let herself consider it for another 2 days. But she could not let them down. Not like this. Not any more. She returned to the prospect again and again, imagining the words she would say, imagining the precise turn of her neck, imagining how someone in the household might respond, and what she would do if they asked her this question or that. The second time, she didn't cry. The third, her hands scarcely shook. By the time she had done it 50 times, her determination had become a bonfire. That evening, 3 weeks after they'd come to Adrian's house, she sat with Adrian at dinner one night. "We'd like to see what you say about designs," he said. "They're almost finished." "Good." She looked down at her plate, then over at him. He was watching her with an intensity that prickled the palms of her hands, the soles of her feet. "Tomorrow morning?" he asked. "If you wish." She inhaled, almost afraid to commit herself. But she'd promised herself, and him, and she'd promised Jane and Lainey. So she swallowed her worries and moved forward. "I know what we need to get our annulment," she told him. "I know how to get it, and I'm prepared to do it." Chapter 16. "Centralization, you said?" Teresa's brother folded his arms and kicked his legs out impatiently from the seat where he had spent the last handful of weeks. "Less time in an office sitting around, you said?" He looked at the heavy volume in front of him. "We'll do better than the man Christian paid a vast sum to, who does this for a living." "Really, T?" Admittedly, their quest had not run as smoothly as Teresa had imagined. In her mind, they would have arrived at the General Register office on a Monday and discovered what they needed halfway through that afternoon, before they even had a chance to get hungry for tea. In reality, it had been weeks. Teresa herself would have been bitterly indignant, except she had to pretend serenity for her brother's sake. Instead, she sniffed. "Have some patience, Corporal. Rome wasn't built in a day." Her brother frowned mulishly. "Everyone always says that, but it's never because someone is complaining about an entire city not being constructed over the space of 24 hours. It's always about something utterly stupid that should not take longer than 15 seconds. And we asked last night at dinner, and it turns out that of course the people who Christian hired did go through the General Register office, because they're not idiots, that's why. Your assumptions were wrong, and you were wrong, and I'm tired of sitting here." Teresa shot him a quelling look. How am I supposed to be addressed again? A long sigh. I'm tired of sitting here, sir, he muttered. Well, it was time to bring out her most fearsome weapon. Teresa fixed her brother with a look. You are younger than me, after all, and everyone knows men haven't the patience of women. They never have the chance to develop it. I suppose I have been remiss in not making allowances for your incapacity. That's... Benedict bit off his complaint and glared at her. That's not fair. She waved a hand. You're free to go at any time. Teresa, on the other hand, was going to sit here and go through these damned records for the rest of her natural life if she needed to. The alternative would be that she would be wrong, and she refused to let that happen. Have it your way. Benedict picked up a book. I'm staying. She shot him another look. Corporal Benedict. He let out a groan. I'm staying, sir. Your choice not to desert is commendable. She flipped a page of her record book. And you're right. We did find out last night that Judith's people had looked through the records. That was valuable information. It helps us expand our search, if we must. They were looking for a Camilla Worth. We're looking for anything abnormal involving something that looks a little like her name. Let's start by assuming that she'd make only a minimal change. She's still called Camilla. If I were constructing a false identity, I would use a last name that starts with a W, or maybe a Y. Right. Benedict just looked disgusted. Do you know how many people there are named Camilla in Britain? How are we to pay attention to them all? Teresa set down her book, stood, and strode confidently down the hall, not waiting to see if her brother would follow. Luckily, he scampered after her. There was no point being anything other than confident. We should finish up the marriage registries today, she said as he caught up to her. If we don't find anything there, we'll get to look into birth records. And won't that be a delightful change of pace? In all honesty, they should have started there. A child born out of wedlock was the most likely reason why Camilla would have changed her name. She wasn't about to spring the notion on Benedict's young, innocent ears unless she had no choice. After that, there were penal records and death certificates, but those both sounded terrible, and she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Teresa marched up to the clerk at the marriage records desk as if she were not 15 years of age. She hoped the hat she was wearing made her look older. It was ugly enough. "My good man," she greeted him. That was how the Dowager Marchioness spoke, and it always seemed to get results. He straightened and turned to her. "Yes? How can I help you, miss?" Teresa tilted her head up and attempted to look down her own nose. It didn't work, because he was a good 6 inches taller than she was, and also her nose was somewhat lacking. She felt herself blushing. "I should like to see the marriage registers for 1864 and 1865, if you please. And if you have a folio for recent marriages, we should like to see that." "If you could fill out the request form," he indicated to her right. "But of course, I should be delighted to." "Why are you talking like that?" Benedict asked loudly. "All stodgy-like. Have you had a stick inserted up your—" "Shut up," she responded in a quiet hiss. A bit of lead pencil, 2 minutes, and her terribly scratchy handwriting later was all it took to produce the form. The man took it, bowed, and disappeared into the ranks of shelves behind him. I'm always amazed," Benedict whispered at her side, "that they're willing to give us whatever we ask for, just because we fill out some stupid form. Do they have any idea who you are, and what you do with things that make you angry?" Teresa rolled her eyes at him. "Stop being so dramatic. We're just asking to look at some ruddy pieces of paper. Nobody cares about them, so nobody's going to make off with them. It's not as if we're filing a request to steal the crown jewels."
You'd find a way."
The man came back with 2 books under his arm and a sheaf of bound papers.
"Here you are, miss. You mayn't take them from the room, of course."
"Thank you. You've been most helpful." She and Benedict divided the work between them. Teresa had become almost familiar with the ebb and flow of the reading. The records were divided into books, listing name after name after name, alphabetically set forth, with numbers following after that, indicating where the full record was kept. There were no Camilla Worths married in 1865, Teresa found, nor anyone with a last name starting with a W. She tried a few other combinations, Camilla Cassandra for her middle name, and Camilla Weston for her mother's name. Nothing, and they had gone through weeks of nothing. Boring. Her fingers tapped the table in irritation as she read. She hoped she wouldn't have to go all the way to death records. That would be inconvenient, tragic, and also a terrible birthday present for Judith. Even her diseased, embroidered crows would be preferable to unveiling Camilla's tragic, early grave. "Nothing," Benedict said, closing his own book. "God, I'm weary." Teresa had never been one to give up. Instead, she started on the recent folios. These were easier. Pieces of freshly printed bound materials, much thinner since they contained a few weeks' worth of material each, instead of an entire year. There were only a handful of W's in each sheaf, and she amused herself, making stories about some of the people whose names she saw. Anne Edelbert Wumbler, for instance. She seemed like a solid sort. She owned her own bakery, Teresa decided, but it was actually a sham. Instead, she housed a printing press in the basement, one that produced lewd woodcuts. "What about this?" Benedict, who had started on his own folio, and who had not been distracted by Anne Edelbert Wumbler, pointed to a record. The registry index was sparse at best, listing names, parishes, and the location of where the final record was. Teresa followed her brother's finger and felt her heart begin to hammer. Winters. Camilla Cassandra, Surrey, Lackwich, 1B 902. Oh, God. It could be a coincidence. There was no reason there could not be 2 Camilla Cassandras in the entirety of England. But... She swallowed. She looked over at her brother. "It's her." He said it as guardedly as she did. "At least, it could be. It's the closest we've come." It could be their sister. The moment should have felt more portentous. Drums should have sounded, or a raven could have got into the building and cawed in dismay. Instead, the office whirred about them as if they had not just succeeded. Teresa scarcely remembered her sister. If that person on the registry was Camilla, it left so many questions unanswered. Why had Camilla changed her last name? Why had she not told her own family that she was marrying? Who had she married? This last question they could answer on their own. She smiled at her brother. Here, you've seen me do it. You're the one who found this. You fill out the request for the full record. He did. They waited, holding hands so hard that they squeezed each other's fingers to numbness. Teresa scarcely knew her sister Camilla. She had a vague memory of a dark-haired, laughing girl, swiping Teresa's face clean and patting her on the head. That was it. One single memory, compared with the millions she had for Judith, or the dozens she had for Pree. Maybe Teresa had been afraid to think too much of Camilla. When Teresa had been young, very young, she had accompanied her father and brother to China. She remembered the trip dimly through the gauze of distance that made all her early childhood memories seem impossibly far away. She remembered standing on the deck of the ship. Anthony used to have to keep dragging her away from the edge. She'd been the only child on the trip, and so apparently she'd invented a playmate for the journey, a sister to take the place of the ones she'd left behind. Priya. That was the name she remembered. Pree, for short, had been older, dark-haired, brown-skinned, with laughing brown eyes. She had been maybe Camilla's age, although at 3, Teresa had been unable to judge such things with any degree of certainty. She'd been sweet. She had played games with Teresa, pulling her away from the edge of the ship when Anthony wasn't around, and occasionally sneaking there to stand next to her, watching the waves pass far below. Don't worry, T. I'll keep you safe. Teresa could remember her imaginary sister better than she could Camilla, and it was frightening that her mind could fool itself so well. Perhaps she never let herself think of Camilla because she was afraid that she'd invent something out of nothing. Look at her. She'd invented an entire story, ending in lewd woodcuts around Anne Ethelbert Wumbler, and the poor woman had done nothing but get married. Teresa knew that she worried Judith. In truth, sometimes Teresa thought she worried Judith on purpose. She never wanted to forget that she was different, that her mind did things that other people's minds did not. And maybe she wanted to remind Judith, because she never knew when she would. "It's arrived," Benedict said, breaking Teresa out of this depressing reverie. Thank God. There was nothing more annoying than reflecting on reality. The records from the parish were just sheaves of paper sewn together, so new that Teresa could still smell a hint of pungent ink. Her brother's fingers fumbled to the right page, spreading it open. Camilla Cassandra Winters, age 19. Her parents were listed as George Winters and Anne-Marie Weston. Her occupation was servant. "It's the right age," Benedict breathed. "And isn't that her mother's name?" Camilla had a different mother than Benedict and Teresa. She stared at the name in question. "I think so. George was father's given name." "True," Teresa said slowly. "But everybody's named George. That doesn't necessarily mean anything." Still, it seemed increasingly possible that they'd found their sister. Now all they had to do was find her. A handful of weeks ago, she had married a man named Adrian Hunter. His parents were listed as a John Hunter III and an Elizabeth Denmore. His occupation? Valet. Benedict exhaled. "This will be interesting. Do we tell Judith now?" "Tell Judith what?" asked a voice behind them. Benedict jumped. Teresa was too well disciplined to do so. Inwardly, though, she winced. It was the Dowager Marchioness of Ashford, her sister's mother-in-law. She was a sweet, sweet lady who loved Teresa dearly. Teresa still couldn't figure out why. She looked at the black ink smeared on her gloves from examining freshly printed records and scrunched her hands into fists. "Lady Ashford." Teresa turned. She curtsied. "How lovely to see you. We were just getting ready to go home." The woman raised a single eyebrow. "Teresa, I taught you that trick. You can't go all mannerly on me in an attempt to get out of an explanation. Whatever are you two doing here?" Benedict looked at Teresa. "We were going to tell them anyway." "No, we weren't," Teresa contradicted. She turned to the Dowager. "It's a surprise. For Judith's birthday. We're planning it." The Dowager looked around the General Register office with a dubious air. Teresa could imagine how the place looked to her. An ugly, dusty building, inhabited by men in dour brown suits. They sat at a table surrounded by volumes. It smelled of must. "Yes," she imagined herself saying, "we are obtaining these lovely records requests for Judith's birthday. Who doesn't want to request records?" The Dowager shook her head and sighed. "I knew you were up to something when Judith said you were shopping for hats. You never like shopping. You hate hats. You've been shopping for 3 weeks. Is this a good surprise for Judith?" "It's the best surprise," Teresa said earnestly. The Dowager looked unconvinced. "Would Judith think so? Or will this be like the mice?" "Judith will be overjoyed," Teresa said. "I promise, with everything I have in me." Assuming that Camilla wasn't dead, that was. The woman looked around. "Very well, then. Are you almost finished?" "We've just a few notes to make," Teresa said. "Then we'll be off home." "Off to get a hat," the Dowager told her. And when Teresa's nose wrinkled, she gave her a stern look. "It won't be much of a surprise if Judith suspects you of anything. Finish your whatever it is you're doing. Then, for the sin of telling your sister a lie, I sentence you to hat yourself." "But you know how it is," the Dowager said. "You can be as odd as you like if you're wearing the right hat. And you, my dear, need to watch yourself on that count." "Very well," Teresa frowned. "If I must." Benedict waited until the other woman had retreated to the hall. "You're so nice to her," he murmured. "You're getting soft, General." Teresa glanced at him. "Am not." But she was. She wasn't sure entirely how it had happened. The Dowager hadn't done anything, really, except try to teach Teresa manners and put her in pretty gowns. And then, when she'd realized that both of these things were going extremely badly, she had shifted tacks. Teresa loved Judith, and Judith loved Teresa. But you harbored a different love for someone who had known you since you were a child, a love tempered by the tantrums that you had once thrown. Judith's affection felt so conditional, given only when Teresa behaved. Somehow, that made Teresa not want to behave at all. The Dowager liked Teresa, General Register Office visits, terrible embroidery and all. "She's just got good ideas," Teresa said instead. "She understands me. Judith wants me to be a lady. The Dowager wants me to be happy. And she likes me," just as I am." The Dowager had told her that once, and Teresa had never realized she wanted to hear it until it had been said. But Teresa didn't say that. It made her seem vulnerable, and the one thing she knew for certain was that she could never let her brother see her vulnerability. Adrian had made plans to leave with Camilla tomorrow. Mr. Singh checked the schedules to Lackwich for Adrian. Tomorrow he and Camilla would need to be up before dawn. That meant this was the last morning here before. His thoughts wandered, and he pulled them back to the land of rationality. No point in feeling odd about the matter. They would go to Lackwich, hopefully find proof of Bishop Lassiter's wrongdoing, head immediately to his uncle, and file the paperwork for annulment with his assistance. It was what he wanted. Definitely that. And if they had one more day together, he had a great deal to do. He'd show Camilla the plates and ask her opinion. They'd talk. He would go to work. It would be just like every other day. At that thought, he heard the tap of footsteps, and he looked up. She stood at the top of the staircase, smiling down at him, and it took him a moment to remember that she wasn't his. She could not be. The early morning sunlight cascaded through the east-facing window, catching on motes of sunlight. It danced across her face, as if the daybreak itself was smiling along with her. Oh no. What was he doing, thinking those thoughts about her? And then she skipped down the stairs, and his heart squeezed in his chest. Oh, damn. What was he doing? Right. The china. He was showing her the first run of the china plates that Harville was bringing to the exhibition this year. He should offer her his arm for the walk, but even that seemed too much. Instead, he gave her a smile that he hoped was friendly and not stupid with the pent-up desires that he could not indulge in. Not here. Not about her. "You don't have to come." His voice felt rough. "Of course I don't have to." She smiled up at him. "But I want to. How else will I know what you've been doing all day, every day?" Well, it was a good thing she couldn't see him blush like a schoolboy. "Let's be off, then." He didn't offer her his arm, and she didn't try to take it. Still, he felt the phantom pressure where her hand ought to have rested on the crook of his elbow as they walked. "You know," he could have said, "I like you. I think you're lovely. I think you're brave. I think I want you." He hadn't said the words, and she hadn't said them back, but he felt them on the tip of his tongue. He could see them in the way she tipped her head back to catch his expression, in the way her eyes followed him, bright with happiness. It wasn't love. It was attraction, and there was no place for attraction between them now. He wanted to choose someone, not to give in to lust and physical ardor, trapping himself for the rest of his life. "They're really just review pieces," he told her as they approached the building. "You'll see. We have a lot to do. Once we've settled on the design, we have to make a copper plate for transfer printing the underglaze." He shuffled the keys into his hand and opened the door. "None of those words made sense to me," Camilla said at his side. "Well, I'll explain it if you want. Probably in greater detail than you want. Most people don't want to hear. In any event, after it's been glaze-fired, we enamel it." Their steps echoed in the corridor. He stopped at the door to the studio. "That was last night. I haven't seen the review plates since they were fired." "Does firing change it?" Yes.
The overglaze colours, see, are made of flux, minerals and—
He stopped, catching himself.
Right. You don't need to know.
Her eyes glowed at him. Oh, you can tell me anything. I don't mind. That shy little dip of her head, the splay of pink across her cheeks. She was so damned lovely, the way she blushed so easily. I'd like to hear anything you find interesting, really. And he wanted to tell her. He pulled away.
Well, I should show you the plates. I would go on forever. And it would make more sense if you were looking at something first, don't you think?
They had been laid out in a row on the sideboard.
Here, he said, gesturing her forward. They tell a story. We'll start from the beginning.
She didn't need to tell him how she felt. Not when she already proclaimed it with every smile, with every little blush. He didn't need to tell her either. Not when there were the plates, after all. She came to stand beside him. His heart beat heavily.
Here, he said, pointing. This is the first one. You'll notice that faint green patterned background, redolent of leaves and bamboo. That's the underglaze painting.
She had frozen in place, her eyes trained on the plate. Adrian.
The way we get that light green underglaze is a family secret.
He smiled.
As is the orange in the enamel. That's these colours here, you see? The stripes.
Adrian, it's a tiger and her cubs. He felt a lump in his throat.
Well, so it is.
What's she chasing, that one cub? Is she headed to the river?
He didn't object to her pronoun.
Now that the plate had been glazed, that little stylized dream looked like a glistening star. They'd specially made a paint for it, a mix of blues and greens so light that you could only see the colour when the plate tilted into the light. Gold flecks, real gold, gave it a luminous look.
I don't know, Adrian said. Maybe it's a star. Maybe it's a dream. You decide.
It's lovely. What's the next one? He gestured her on. On this plate, the underglaze was the cobalt blue of traditional China pottery, painted in waves and royals depicting a raging river. The tiger kitten caught in the current, tossed and turned, one paw still outstretched to that stylized star, as if to catch it even in the midst of drowning. Along the riverbank her mother ran, desperate to catch her. Adrian, is that a waterfall ahead?
Yes.
You're sending a kitten into a waterfall?
Maybe. She turned to the next plate. The tiger cub stood on a riverbank, looking up a sheer cliff down which the waterfall thundered. At the very top, small in the distance, were the faces of the mother tiger and her other cubs.
You separated them?
Camilla stood in place, looking at the scene. She set her hand over her heart.
That's not right.
A fourth plate showed the cub sitting at the base of the cliff. Claw marks marked her attempt to climb back up, futilely. The kitten looked almost despondent. But just to the side, leading away from the cliff, that dream glittered. In the fifth plate, the cub, slightly older, traversed a swamp, nervously avoiding being caught by some ugly, sharp-toothed reptile. In the sixth, the cub, now juvenile, padded through a dark forest inhabited by fantastical-looking birds, drawn forward, forever in pursuit of that glittering dream. In the seventh, the tiger stalked the stars themselves, 1,000 dreams flashing around her paws. In the final plate, fully grown, she descended a mountain,
crowned in stars, to the valley where her mother awaited. Camilla set the final plate down and looked at Adrian. I don't know a thing about art. I couldn't give you any advice at all. Her eyes shimmered.
Did you like it?
Gave me feelings. She tapped her chest. Here.
That's always a good sign.
She swallowed and turned to him. It's about a tiger.
Yes.
Her eyes found his. You tell me I'm a tiger sometimes.
Well?
He put his hands in his pockets, the better not to touch her with them.
Yes, I do.
Her eyes were so wide, so bright with hope. Are these about me? The tiger cub, lost from a home so young, searching for years as she grows, going from place to place.
Never giving up, he added, looking forward, always forward.
She made a little sound in her throat.
Really, he said, I don't want to give you the wrong idea. It's about all of us. Mr. Alabi left his home at 12, when war came to his home city. Mrs. Song came to Britain in search of a child who had been impressed in the pig trade.
She looked away. Oh.
As for me, Adrian said, my family left me in England during the rebellion. We were reunited afterward, but I lost 3 of my brothers. That's why, at the end, some tigers are missing.
She turned to him. Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't know. And here I've been complaining to you. I should never have done it.
He looked away. I don't talk much about it. I'm the lucky one. I didn't die. I didn't even have to go to war. There are untold millions who will never have what I have. There's no point asking for sympathy for me when so many have less.
Adrian, you don't need to ask for sympathy. You deserve it.
God, if he looked down on her now, he would take every inch of comfort she was offering, the liquid warmth of her eyes. She almost reached for him, then pulled back. In any event, the plates. He cleared his throat. I just help my lead artists put things together. All the feelings you saw in there, they weren't all mine. The tiger's journey wasn't entirely about you. It was about all of us. But her breath caught on that word, entirely, betraying as it was. She looked up at him. But his voice was low. It was partially about you. Because I think you could belong. He didn't say it, though. They were going to Lackwich tomorrow, and the sound of a door opening echoed down the corridor. Camilla jumped away from him, blushing, and Adrian exhaled. I thought, Adrian said, in the moments before whoever it was arrived, that even if you moved on after this, that this way you might stay here a little too. Even if. There, he'd said it. Put the possibility out in the world. Her eyes widened. Behind them, the door to the studio opened. Mr. Alabi strode in. Ah, he said. Miss Winters, what do you think of my plates? Camilla straightened, smiling at Mr. Alabi as if, a moment ago, she hadn't looked as if Adrian had handed her the stars. Your plates? She shook her head. And here I thought they were everyone's plates. But I am a part of everyone. I hate your plates, Camilla said. Alabi's face fell. They almost made me cry. They were so perfect. She gestured to him. Here, I'll tell you what I thought. Let's start from the beginning.
By the time Adrian returned that night, he had made all the arrangements to start final production in earnest. Their train left early the next morning. He had already tasked Mr. Singh to pick them up at the break of dawn. A valise sat by the door, Camilla's. It did not escape his notice that she had, once again, packed everything she owned into her one piece of luggage. She'd leave nothing behind. She wasn't wrong to do so. If she simply walked into Rector Miles's house and walked off with a record book, showing everything that had been done, then they'd go off to his uncle, present him with the evidence, have their annulment, and... what? Never see each other again. God. This might be the last evening they had together. He made his way into the parlour. Camilla sat on the edge of her chair, biting her lip. She had a ball of yarn in her hands. She was crocheting something. He didn't know what that misshapen lump could be. They greeted each other. They always did. She asked about his day. He inquired as to hers. Then silence fell. It was a silence stalked by the memory of tigers and plates. After 10 minutes of glancing her way, he gave up on pretending. "Nervous?" he asked. "I keep thinking," she said. "I'm thinking of what to say when I arrive at the rectory. There's part of me that says that they lied first, and so I shouldn't let myself be bothered by it. But I am." "They did lie," he said, with as much authority as he, someone who had once spent a few months acting as page for a bishop, could provide. "You shouldn't feel badly at all." She bit her lip again. "What if they don't believe me?" "Don't worry. I'm sending a telegram beforehand, remember? Purporting to be from Bishop Lassiter. Miles will be out of the house to respond. Nobody there will know the truth in his absence. They'll respond positively if you sound certain. It's human nature." She nodded slowly. "Go through it, then," he said gently. "Tell me what you are going to do. The more you think it through, the more real it will be. The easier it will be to execute in the moment. Let's practice now." She nodded, this time less slowly. "I will come in shortly after he has left." "Not looking like that," he said, smiling at her. "If you come in looking like that, all nervous, they'll doubt you. Look at them the way you looked at Alabi this morning, when you were sassing him." She shut her eyes and looked away. One inhalation, then another, and she stood. When she opened her eyes, there was a light smile on her face and a sparkle in her eyes. He felt a knot form in his chest. God, she was lovely. "Like that." His throat felt dry as he spoke. "Do it just like that. What will you say to them?" She spun around, her skirt flaring briefly around her ankles, before smiling at him. "I've just realized." Her smile broadened. "I'm definitely going to tell them the truth. 2 lies don't right a wrong, now do they? And the more truth I tell, the stronger I will feel." He didn't want to contradict her, not when her confidence seemed so shaky, but he had to say it. "I'm not precisely sure the truth will be effective." Camilla just licked her lips and took a step toward him. "Oh, for goodness sake, Albert," she said, and her voice had an almost amused quality to it. "You didn't actually believe all that, did you? That was a stage drama." He swallowed. She sashayed toward Adrian, one step at a time. "The whole thing was a ruse. Half-price Camilla? The rector simply didn't want anyone to take me seriously." Well, he tried to get into his role as... Who was Albert again? It didn't help that he knew almost nothing of the man, save a vague memory of brown hair.
Why would he do that?
Did you not notice that he called me into his office to consult, occasionally on serious matters? I've been in communication with other members of the church, of course.
She came next to Adrian and sat on the arm of his chair. She seemed so absolutely in control, so utterly right and perfect in the role. Adrian could hardly bring himself to breathe.
Don't tell me you actually believed any of that. I thought you smarter than that.
She reached out and set a finger on the top button of his coat. Camilla. His voice came out hoarse.
He wanted the bishop to think me discredited, so I could go assist with some other matters. But here I am.
She tilted her head in an inch, so close that he could almost taste her.
I've returned. Did you miss me?
And in that moment, he did. It made no rational sense. He'd talked to her every day for weeks. He could not possibly miss her. But he felt the distance between them, that bare inch, so keenly that he almost vibrated with it. Come. Her name came out almost a groan. She swayed toward him, not quite completing what he wanted, and he reached out. Maybe it was to steady her in place. Maybe it was just to touch her. His hand found her waist. She exhaled, and he could feel her breath, on his lips, in his heart.
One of my favorite duties, she whispered, used to be starting the morning fires. Our room was cold. Coal being too dear to waste on servants who would warm themselves in labour. So I'd dress in the morning, my hands too numb to do my buttons, and rush downstairs. There was pride to be had in adding kindling bit by bit, blowing on the banked coals, encouraging them to catch flame in a blast of heat. He could almost taste her words. He could feel the picture she painted, that warmth of the fire. His hand was on her waist. She leaned in a little more, so her forehead touched his. I always dawdled as much as I could about the job, letting my hands grow warm. I'd find some excuse. I needed to make sure the fire caught everywhere so that it burned evenly. I wouldn't leave, even if I threatened to bake through.
Come. He felt almost hoarse.
I have always been susceptible to flame, she told him.
He wasn't sure if his lips found hers first, or if hers found his. God, oh God, he couldn't think. He couldn't let himself. If he thought, this couldn't happen, and it had to happen. He could not have let himself stop, not for 1,000 rational arguments. The gentle pressure of her mouth on his felt like a promise. Her lips whispered against his, wiping away his concerns one by one. It will all work out. You have nothing to fear from me. We are in this together. He had thought at first that he could simply get the annulment and walk away unchanged. Then she'd worked her way inside him, with her smiles and her impulses and her strength. Now she was fire itself, and he wanted to be burned. Her lips stroked his in tiny little kisses, almost chaste, despite the heat in them. His other hand slipped around her waist, bracketing her in place. He felt full, so full. His mouth devoured hers, and she opened another inch to him, blooming in the incandescent heat of his kiss. Her lips burned him, and oh, he desired. He wanted more, her on top of him, not sitting to the side, her opening to him fully, not this chaste embrace. But he couldn't take anything else, not after what had been done to her.
All he could do was stand here and wait for her to give. Their lips touched briefly, parted for a second, then came back together in a symphony of perfection. It was too much. He wanted her too much. He wanted to take hold of her and pull her down onto his lap. He wanted to lick her lips and slide his tongue inside, if she'd let him. He wanted to take her upstairs to his bed, no questions asked, not a moment of hesitation, and damn the fact that it would doom any chance of annulling the marriage. He wanted her and nothing but her forever. She brought one hand up tentatively, setting her fingers against the fabric of his shirt. For one moment, she didn't move. Then, ever so slightly, she stroked downward, sending a spiral of electric want through his nerves. Her hand slid down his ribs, a delicate brush against his flesh. I want you. I care for you. See you. He let out a gasp, and, encouraged, she shifted her hand farther down, letting it catch on the waistband of his trousers. Yes, he thought wildly. Yes, don't stop. Don't. She pulled away first. Her eyes were suspiciously bright. She jumped to her feet, leaving him feeling cold and alone. Oh, look at that. She did her best to come up with a smile. It worked. I can't believe it worked. You knew it was an act, and still I fooled you. It took a moment for reality to set in. Right. He'd been play-acting. He almost reached for her. His protest almost came out. What was that he felt? Disappointment? Surely he could not be disappointed. He'd been on the verge of letting go of the entirety of his future. He should be delighted that she had called a halt to the endeavour. He was not delighted. He wanted to keep her. It felt so selfish, so desperate, so wrong. He wanted to keep her, and he couldn't. He put his head in his hands. Truth, eh? He'd never been good at lying. Cam, he muttered. I wasn't acting. He could hear her stillness, the lack of motion. He could almost envision the look on her face. She let out a long, slow breath, and when she spoke, her voice was low. I know. I'm sorry. That was cruel of me. I thought you would come to your senses at any moment, and figured it would hurt less if I did it first. He lifted his head, and their eyes met. Hers were dark and, no, not unreadable. She was watching him with an intensity that he understood all too well. She'd looked at him that way often enough. And what, he said slowly, if I didn't want to come to my senses? She folded her arms and looked away. Then it would hurt even more when you finally did. Oh, Cam, brave Cam, clever Cam, vastly unloved Cam, Cam who chased stars and deserved to wear her dreams like a crown. He wanted to punch the entire world for what it had done to her. She should not have felt that way. She should not have been right. He stood and took a step toward her. Please, she sniffed. We shouldn't. I won't, he promised. Not that. But would it hurt so much if I gave you a hug? Yes. Her voice cracked. But it will hurt more if you don't. He wrapped her in his arms and held on as tightly as he could. It was just for now, but he wanted to enfold her in all the comfort he could send. And she burrowed into him, melting as if she were meant to be moulded to him. Her chest shook, just a little, and when he brushed her cheek, there was a little wetness to it. God, how long had it been since someone touched her in affection? He realized he'd asked the question aloud when she answered, "It feels as if I've been 9 years starving." He stroked her hair. This was unfair, so unfair, most of all to her.
And here you are, not allowed to eat.
She shook her head. "I'm allowed, but I'll pay the price. If we let ourselves do any more, we will be married, in truth." It was madness to think they should contemplate that possibility. He didn't want it. If he gave in like this, what if he regretted it later? What he said was this.
Am I so horrible, then?
She looked up at him. "You know you're not. Of course you're not. But you told me so yourself. You don't want a wife who will choose you because you're not so horrible." And she felt she didn't have a choice. "You want—" She inhaled. "You want a long, slow falling in love." She said those words precisely, as if she'd memorized what he'd told her those weeks ago. Partnership, built over time, certainty and sureness. You want a choice, and you want to be chosen. You don't want this, not like this.
Cam.
She looked up at him. She reached out and slowly, slowly touched his cheek. "Adrian, I like you well enough that I promise I am going to give that to you. Don't give it up. Not like this." He exhaled. She pulled herself from his embrace and wrapped her own arms about herself. "Tell me about your parents again. What you said the last time. It was lovely. I want to hear it again." "I need to hear it again," he heard, "and so do you." He nodded. He sat back down, because if he didn't, he might reach for her once more. His hands made fists on the arms of the chair, as if holding on to it would somehow substitute for her.
My mother married young, once. She never speaks of that. After her first husband died and left her a wealthy widow, she defied her family to join the abolitionist movement. She devoted her fortune to the cause. Worked with my father for years. My parents fell in love slowly and surely.
That sounds lovely.
They were comrades in arms before they were ever married.
Cam had become his comrade, his ally in truth, not just in name. Even now she protected him. She was the one who was reminding him what he wanted, no matter what it cost her. He trailed off, searching for the right words.
"You're right,"
he finally said.
"I want a choice."
He looked up at her.
"And I want you to have one too. You've had so little of it. I want whoever ends up loving you to know that you could have had anyone in the world, and you chose him. I want him to think that he has had a gift bestowed upon him, not that he was sentenced to your company by circumstance. You deserve better than this."
Funny how she'd faced everything that happened to her in the rector's household with nothing but resolve, but this could bring tears to her eyes.
"You deserve to have no doubts," he told her. "You deserve to believe that you were wanted above all others."
His heart hurt in his chest.
"You deserve everything I want," he told her. "You deserve a partner, a comrade in arms, a slow falling in love. You don't deserve to be stuck with a man, simply because he's got a hankering for his own pleasure."
"Is that what you're after?" He didn't answer. He'd made a set of plates for her, partially at least,
It wasn't as if he could hide the fact that he had some finer feelings.
"We can't give each other anything else," she said quietly. "But I can give you that. If that's what you want, if you want a slow falling in love, if you want joy, if you want not to be stuck with a woman simply because she'll do, and you've a hankering for pleasure, then I will make sure you have it."
His throat almost closed.
"I'm sorry for what I did earlier."
She gave him a firm nod.
"Teasing you when we were practicing. I will not let myself forget. We have too many enemies in this world to be at odds with each other on the question of how we feel."
And what if we decide we want to choose each other? She didn't speak for a long time. She bit her lip. She looked away.
"I've been alone a long time," she finally said. "I've wanted someone, anyone. Rector Miles made me believe that when I told myself I would be loved, it was a legion of devils driving me into sin. He told me the tiny voice of doubt I always heard was my sole hold on righteousness."
Her voice shook.
"But I refuse. I cannot believe it is evil to hope somebody will love me someday.
Come.
I never needed that person to be a husband. I imagined being a faithful companion to an elderly woman, a bright spot in the day of a shopkeeper, and yes, sometimes a wife."
She looked over at him.
"I don't have to be your wife, Adrian. But can I be your friend? No matter what, even after all this is over. It would be more than I have ever had."
There was nothing for it. He stood. He walked to her again. His arm came around her once more, this time in friendship. His head leaned against hers. "Yes," he said. "Please. I think we could both use a friend." Chapter 17. Camilla lay alone in her bed that night, knowing that she should sleep. Tomorrow they would embark on a long journey. If they were successful, Adrian would disappear from her life. In her heart, she knew she was susceptible to praise, that she was practically starved for affection. Even the offer of a scrap of goodwill would have had her heart in a tangle, but he'd given her a veritable feast. Actual respect, friendship, encouragement, 8 plates of tigers. Of course she had fallen in love with him. It didn't mean anything. She would have fallen in love with anyone who gave her as much. No matter how much her brain told her this, her heart still hurt. Part of her wanted to go back to their time together in that room, to that moment when he'd looked at her and he'd desired her, and their lips had come together in heat and fire. She wanted to throw her inconvenient sense of right and wrong in the dustbin. She didn't want her stupid conscience. She just wanted his hands on her. It would take so little to get it back, and if she did, she could have him forever. All she had to do was stand, go down the corridor to his room at the end of the hall. If she were to show up in nothing but a nightgown, if they consummated this thing between them, there would be no annulment. She put her hands over her face. God, she was a horrible person to even think such a grasping, calculating thing. To trap another person for the rest of their lives. That wasn't love. She knew it wasn't love. Still, she shut her eyes and let her imagination run wild. She didn't want to trap him. She'd spent enough time with people who didn't like her. She could hardly hope to spend the rest of her life with someone who felt the same.
She couldn't even find joy in imagining it. Her breath hissed out, "But what if he wanted you? What if he was in his room, thinking the things she was thinking? What if he was thinking not of his imminent freedom, but of his loss? What if he decided he wanted her? He might stand up in his night things." She didn't know what he wore to bed, but her imagination stuttered, and she imagined nothing at all. He'd feel the way she did. He'd find a robe, or perhaps a spare sheet for modesty's sake. She shut her eyes, thinking of what he'd look like in the moonlight, his skin showing like midnight through almost translucent bedsheets. He'd stand, pace his room, thinking of what to do. He'd make his decision after an hour of deliberation, that he didn't want an annulment, that he wanted her instead. Adrian did not strike her as the sort of person to put off acting on decisions once they were made. He'd take off down the hall. He would tap lightly on her door. She would never tell him no, not in a million years. He'd tell her that he had chosen, that he didn't want to be without her. And Camilla would reach out and pull the ends of that sheet. In her imagination, it was a strip of almost sheer gossamer from his grasp. They'd kiss the way they had wanted to kiss tonight, skin to skin, his hands holding her in place as if she were precious, as if he didn't want to let go. She could imagine him trailing kisses down her neck. She could imagine herself giving in, the heat of his breath against her throat, the slide of his body against hers, his hardness. She wasn't a virgin. She knew what would happen. She wanted it to happen. She wanted it rather desperately. Her hands slipped between her thighs. It wasn't helping matters at all to think this way about him, to touch herself and imagine his fingers instead of her own, to bite back her own response. She had told him that she wanted to earn love, not steal it. She had hoped he would see through her words, to understand that she wanted his adoration, his attention. She wanted it now. It was madness to do what she was doing, imagining him pressing on top of her, his lips finding hers. She did it anyway. She shivered as she imagined him inside her, thick and hot, his hands tangled in her hair. She thought of him whispering that he wanted her, only her, for the rest of their lives. It was madness to feel this kind of desire, something that was so deep her fingers could not palpate it. She wanted him to want her. It was madness to wonder if he was in his room, feeling the things she did, that flutter of desire deep in her abdomen, flames fanning with every brush of her own fingers. In her imagination, she could have him. She could dig her nails into his back, encouraging him to take everything from her and give it back. It was too easy to imagine their joining, too easy, and yet so impossible when it was just her lonely hands bringing out her own response. Even the orgasm that came felt imperfect, unfulfilling. She could hear her own breath panting out in the night, the only sound present in the stillness. She shut her eyes. God, she was such a fool. He was asleep. He was grateful she'd called a halt to their activities earlier. She wasn't going to have his love. She'd take his gratitude, and it would be not enough. It would never be enough. She stood, washing herself off, wiping away the stupid tears that insisted on coming now that she was alone, demonstrably alone. Her skin felt hungry, almost desperately so, for another person's touch. That tiny taste earlier had only whetted her appetite. Camilla exhaled slowly and nodded at the darkness in front of her. So be it. She'd built fantasies in her imagination before, and she'd survived the wreckage of them when they crashed against the unforgiving shoals of reality. She was good at that, surviving the inevitable destruction of her hopes. She would do it again. In the corridor, a board squeaked. She straightened, turning. Her heart beat double time. It was him. He was coming. He was here. He cared. She waited, breathless, time drawing out until hope fell into discouragement. There was nothing. She let out a long breath. That creak was merely the sort of sound that a house made at night. She'd always been good at reconstructing shattered hopes. She did it now, building the truth out of the ruins of her desire. He didn't love her. She had survived not being loved this long. She would survive it longer. He didn't love her, but he did like her, and it was more than she'd been given in ages. He liked her, and he wanted well for her. It wasn't enough, not forever, but that would be enough for now. For giving her that much, she would give him anything he wanted. The thing he wanted was for her to shatter her own heart, true, but her heart had been broken before. Now she knew the truth of heartbreak. That morning would come, and she would stand up and move on. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, until all sense of sound finally dissolved into the nothingness of sleep. The train ride east to Surrey, then down to Lackwich, was one of awkward silences. Every time Camilla thought of how brazen she'd been the night before, seating herself on the arm of his chair, leaning in, practically taunting him until she was unsure of who had actually closed the gap between them, she felt herself colouring. He hadn't said anything about their tryst that morning. He'd only looked at her, and the way he'd looked, she had to hold herself back from hoping. She had no space for hope, no space for worry, not when she had this final duty to perform. He did not say anything as he had the telegram sent. He did not say anything as he walked with her halfway down the all-too-familiar road. He stopped a half-mile out, with the house where she had spent 18 months on the horizon. Don't look back, she thought, but she finally could. Her hands felt cold. He reached out and took hold of them. "Camilla," he said. It was a friendly gesture, she reminded herself, because they were friends. It was a gesture of comfort and maybe a little more, but Camilla had been desired before, and she wouldn't let it change what she had to do. She loved him, but it would end. She loved him, and she'd learned to pull her confidence about her like a cloak. She loved him, and he had brought her to Jane and Lainey, her sisters in marriage annulment, and it was for them that she did this, for all the women who had been given no choice. She patted his hand. "Don't worry," she said cheerily. "I won't fail us." His fingers convulsed around hers. She made herself smile at him as brightly as she could, and he almost flinched at the sight. She'd misjudged it, unfortunately. Too bright, then. She pulled away and started off down the road. Miles wasn't there. He was the one who had made it all go to hell. Miles wasn't there, and she had discovered that she was stronger than he'd thought. Miles wasn't there, and and Camilla was walking up the path. She felt a little out of sorts, almost as if she were observing herself from a distance. The brick and ivy walls of the rectory seemed impossibly far away, even when she was standing on the stoop. She didn't knock. Only someone who did not belong would knock. She opened the door to the rectory and walked in. She kept walking, down the hall, past the parlour and into the rector's office. She knew what she was looking for. She knew where the record books were kept. She kept going forward, reading spine after spine. Her heart beat heavily in her chest. Her fingers tapped in time with that rhythm as she went. Not this one. Not this next one. "Camilla?" The voice came from behind her. She whirled around. Damn it! Why? Why did she have to jump like a scolded child? She reached for her rationality, her confidence. "Kitty?" Her voice trembled. God damn it, she had practiced. Why hadn't it been easy, the way she had practiced? It was something in the air, something in the place where she stood. It sapped all pretense at confidence. Kitty took a step forward, frowning at Camilla. "Camilla?" She too was trembling. "Camilla? Camilla, you're back. You're back. I thought I'd never see you again. Here I am." Camilla managed to sound bright and cheery, which was a good first start. She reached for some useful truths that would form a false impression. "It's funny. You seem to be upset. The rector—" "I had to," Kitty said, bursting into tears. I'm sorry I ever called you half-price anything. But he did it to me before you arrived. And I was just so grateful that it wasn't me anymore that—" She choked. "That I went along with it. And once I did, there was no turning back. He ordered me to lock you in, to put the keys in your pocket. And he offered to give me money. And my girl, she needs it so much. My sister has her." Kitty wiped away tears. "My sister has her, and she's kind enough, but you know how it is. She's going to think of herself as half-price Ellie if I don't do something about it. And she's only 3. Camilla should be angry. Kitty had just admitted to lying, to creating that horrific scene that had trapped her. Camilla would have been enraged a few weeks ago. Instead, she reached out and took Kitty's hands impulsively. "None of us have to be half-price anything anymore, you hear?" Kitty just shook her head. "I didn't know you had a daughter." "He said if I didn't tell anyone," Kitty hiccuped. "Oh, Kitty. What happened to me here was terrible. I doubted myself. I doubted reality. There were nights I wondered if I had maybe put the keys in my own pocket. I doubted my own senses. You can't forgive me." Kitty bowed her head. "I didn't expect it. Honestly, truly, I didn't." Camilla squeezed her hand. "No, that's not what I'm saying. I am telling you that more than anyone in the world, I know what you've been through. You're not the one in need of forgiveness. I pray to God for the chance to make things right with you," Kitty whispered. "But what can I do?" "You can change everything now," Camilla told her. "Come with me. If you want to make things right, come with me and we'll tell the truth. We'll find you work." Kitty sniffled. "Who is we?" "Me and Adrian. I mean, Mr. Hunter." Camilla's hand landed on the book of records that she needed. She opened it and looked through it, flipping until she came to the right date. There. She had it. Now she just needed his personal accounts. You want to make it right? Would you be willing to swear that he had you lock us in? That he asked you to tell untruths? There was a moment's pause. Then, yes, Kitty said. Camilla nodded. Come, pack your things and meet me across the way. There isn't a lot of time. Kitty smiled ruefully. Don't worry. I haven't many things. Chapter 18. Over the last few days, Teresa had learned a great deal that she hadn't ever expected to know. She and Benedict had pooled their allowances and managed to hire an investigator, of dubious origins, who had gone to the place where Camilla had been married in order to obtain information about the couple. He'd come back with a description of a woman who could have been their sister, plump, dark-haired,